Portugal learned preservation early. Earthquakes, long droughts, and an unforgiving Atlantic forced foresight. The 1755 Lisbon earthquake wiped out markets overnight. Centuries earlier, sailors crossed oceans for months with no resupply. These compelled Portuguese to stockpile these 20 foods that never expire, and it begins with what Portugal salted before it ever sailed. Before it was a recipe, bacalhau was a strategy. Long before refrigeration or reliable supply lines, Portugal needed protein that could cross oceans and outlast months at sea. By the 15th century, Portuguese fishermen were already reaching the cold waters of the North Atlantic, including Newfoundland, returning with cod preserved only by salt and wind. Fresh cod spoils quickly. Salted cod does not. The process is deliberate. Cod is split, heavily salted, and laid out to dry, traditionally under open air. Salt draws out moisture, stopping bacteria before spoilage can begin. Once fully cured, bacalhau becomes hard, pale, and almost weightless. Stored dry, it can last for years, not weeks, not months. This made bacalhau essential during the Age of Discoveries. Sailors relied on it during voyages that lasted months with no resupply. Inland villages relied on it during Lent, famine, and winter when fresh meat was scarce or forbidden. By the 17th century, bacalhau had become inseparable from Portuguese identity, even though the fish itself came from distant seas. Before cooking, it is soaked to release salt and awaken the flesh. Then it becomes countless dishes, baked, shredded, stewed, or fried. A preserved fish turned into comfort food. It is firm, austere, and enduring. And yet, the next food does not come from the sea. It comes from the soil, dried slowly, waiting just as patiently. Long before they filled stews and salads, chickpeas were valued for something simpler. They waited. Introduced to the Iberian Peninsula during Roman rule and deeply embedded by Moorish agriculture between the 8th and 13th centuries, grão de bico thrived in Portugal's dry southern regions, especially Alentejo. Chickpeas are harvested at full maturity and dried completely in the sun. This single step removes the moisture that invites spoilage. Stored in cloth sacks or sealed jars, dried chickpeas remain edible for decades. They do not ferment. They do not rot. They only sleep. For centuries, Portuguese households relied on dried legumes as winter protein. During famine years and Lent, chickpeas replaced meat. A handful could become a meal after soaking overnight and simmering slowly. They appear in cozidos, soups, and salads, absorbing flavor while holding their shape. Humble, filling, and efficient. Food that stretches effort into sustenance. Chickpeas do not demand immediacy, they reward patience. But while legumes endure by drying quietly, the next staple does the same in greater numbers, filling sacks and cellars with abundance meant to last through hunger. Beans made survival routine in Portugal. Introduced widely after transatlantic contact in the 16th century, dried beans quickly became central to rural diets from Minho to Ribatejo. They grew well, stored easily, and fed families when little else did. After harvest, beans were left on the vine or spread in barns to dry completely. Once the skins hardened, they were shelled and stored in sacks, sometimes with bay leaves to deter insects. With no remaining moisture, spoilage had no foothold. Dried beans can last indefinitely when kept dry. For generations, this made them a cornerstone of Portuguese food security. A sack of beans meant weeks of nourishment. During poor harvests or wartime shortages, they stood between hunger and survival. Cooked slowly, they soften and swell, turning scarcity into fullness. They appear in feijoadas, soups, and peasant dishes that prize substance over spectacle. They are cheap, they are reliable, they endure. Yet not every preserved food relies on dryness alone. The next one uses salt, smoke, and blood, locking nourishment into something far more intense. Morcella was born on slaughter days, when nothing could be wasted and everything had to last. Made from pork blood, fat, spices, and sometimes rice, it has existed in Portugal since at least the Middle Ages, particularly in the north and interior regions. Fresh mortella is perishable. Preserved mortella is not. After stuffing into casings, the sausages are salted and smoked over wood fires. Smoke and salt work together, drawing out moisture and creating an environment hostile to bacteria. Once cured, morcella can be stored in cool, dry places for extended periods. In rural homes, sausages hung from rafters or beams, darkening slowly as they aged. They waited until needed. Morcella appears sliced into stews, grilled over flame, or folded into rice dishes. Rich, mineral, and deeply savory, it carries the memory of thrift and respect for the animal. It is heavy food for hard times. And after blood and smoke, the pantry turns again to the sea, sealed this time in tin rather than salt. For a country bound to the Atlantic, sardines were never just food. They were abundance that had to be controlled. By the late 19th century, Portugal became one of Europe's centers for fish canning, especially along the coasts of Setúbal, Matosinhos, and Algarve ports where sardines arrived in overwhelming numbers. Fresh sardines spoil within hours. Canning changed that. The fish are cleaned, lightly cooked, or steamed, packed by hand into sterilized tins and sealed with olive oil, tomato, or spices. A final heat treatment destroys bacteria and locks the contents away from air. This process allows unopened tins to last for years without refrigeration. During the early 20th century and both world wars, canned sardines fed civilians, soldiers, and sailors alike. Factories worked day and night, turning the sea's generosity into shelf-stable security. Over time, sardines soften inside their tins. Bones dissolve, flavor deepens. Many consider aged tins better than fresh. Opened, they are eaten straight, layered on bread, or served with peppers and wine. They are oily, rich, and direct. A preserved piece of the Atlantic held in steel. But while sardines rely on metal and oil, the next food turns sun and peppers into something thick, red, and enduring. Bright red and intensely fragrant, massa de pimentão captures Portugal's late summer in a jar. Rooted in the Alentejo, where peppers thrive under strong sun, this paste has been made for centuries as a way to save flavor beyond harvest. The process begins with ripe red peppers, washed, seeded, and ground into a thick pulp. Salt is added generously. Sometimes garlic or bay leaf follows. The mixture is packed into jars and sealed with olive oil on top to block air. Salt and oil do the preserving. High salinity prevents microbial growth, while the oil creates a barrier. Properly stored massa de pimentão can last for years without spoiling, deepening in flavor as it rests. It is used sparingly, rubbed onto pork before grilling, stirred into stews, spread thinly on bread. During lean times, it turned plain food into something comforting and familiar. This paste is sun-made solid, sweet, salty, and enduring. And after peppers preserved by salt, the pantry shifts again, this time to fire, spirit, and liquids meant not to feed, but to last without changing. Clear, sharp, and unapologetic, aguardente was never meant to be gentle. It was meant to last. Distilled spirits appear in Portugal as early as the 15th century, spreading alongside monasteries, vineyards, and sugarcane fields in Madeira. When wine spoiled or fruit threatened to rot, distillation turned loss into permanence. Aguardente begins with fermented wine, grapes, figs, or sugarcane. The liquid is heated until alcohol evaporates, then condensed back into a clear spirit. What remains is high proof, low moisture, and hostile to bacteria. Once sealed in glass, aguardente does not spoil. It does not age unless chosen to. It simply endures. Portuguese households kept bottles in cupboards and cellars for generations. It was medicine, disinfectant, preservative, and comfort, used to fortify wine, macerate fruit, or warm bodies after cold nights. During hardship, it became currency and remedy. It burns going down. It lingers afterward. A reminder that preservation sometimes means stripping things to their strongest core, but not everything preserved is liquid fire. The next food returns to smoke, salt, and flesh, hung patiently, sliced sparingly, and made to wait in the dark. Chorizo is preservation that you can smell before you see it. Deep red, firm, and smoky, it has been part of Portuguese life since at least the Middle Ages. Pork slaughter took place once a year. What followed determined survival. Chorizo begins with pork seasoned heavily with salt, garlic, paprika, and wine. The mixture is stuffed into natural casings and hung to dry. Days later, it is smoked slowly over wood fires. Salt removes moisture. Smoke adds protection. Time finishes the job. The result is a sausage that can last months, even years, when kept cool and dry. Before refrigeration, chorizo hung from beams in kitchens and cellars. It was sliced thin, never wasted, stretched across meals. Used to flavor beans, stews, rice, and soups, chorizo is rarely the main ingredient. It is a backbone, a source of richness added carefully. It is bold. It is enduring. It carries fire and smoke forward. And yet, after meat and spirit, the pantry turns again to the sea, this time sealed in oil, quiet, and meant to age rather than fade. Tuna preservation in Portugal is older than the can itself. As early as the Roman period, between the 1st century BCE and the 3rd century CE, fish salting factories operated along the Algarve coast, particularly near Tavira and Legumes. Tuna was abundant but fleeting. Preservation turned seasonal runs into lasting food. Modern canning arrived much later. In the late 19th century, the first tuna canneries opened in the Algarve and the Azores, especially on São Jorge and Pico Islands. By the early 1900s, Portugal had become a major producer, supplying local households, maritime workers, and export markets. The process is precise. Fresh tuna is cleaned, lightly cooked, packed into sterilized tins, then covered with olive oil or brine. The cans are sealed and heat processed, killing bacteria and excluding oxygen. Once sealed, tuna becomes shelf-stable for years. During World War I and World War II, canned tuna was essential. It fed civilians when fresh food was scarce and traveled easily without refrigeration. Many families stored tins specifically for emergencies. Inside the can, time improves the fish. Oil softens fibers, bones dissolve, flavor deepens. It is sea movement stopped, protein made patient, but preservation did not belong only to factories. Inland, another food stretched scarcity using flour, smoke, and necessity. Farinhera was born during hardship. In the interior regions of Trás-os-Montes and Beira Alta, winters were long and pigs were slaughtered only once a year. By the 17th and 18th centuries, families needed ways to make limited meat last. Unlike other sausages, Farinhera contains no chunks of meat. Instead, wheat flour is mixed with pork, fat, garlic, paprika, wine, and salt. This paste is stuffed into casings, then lightly smoked and dried. Drying removes moisture. Smoke and salt protect what remains. The result is a sausage that can hang for months without spoiling. Stored in cool kitchens or cellars, Farinhera became a reserve food, used sparingly, often crumbled into eggs, rice, or stews to add richness without wasting meat. During the 19th century and into the 20th, Farinhera was common among rural families surviving poor harvests and political instability. It represented thrift rather than luxury. Soft inside, smoky outside, it dissolves into dishes rather than dominating them. A sausage designed to disappear slowly. And after flour turned into meat, the pantry prepares to return to something simpler still. Bulbs, fruit, and trees that preserve themselves when treated with patience. Garlic has never needed preservation invented for it. It arrived with its own. Grown across Portugal since Roman times, garlic appears in agricultural records from Lusitania as early as the 1st century CE, prized for both food and medicine. It thrived in dry regions like Ribatejo and Alentejo, where bulbs matured under long sun. After harvest in late spring or early summer, garlic is tied into braids and hung in shaded, ventilated spaces. This curing period, practiced for centuries, dries the outer layers and seals moisture inside each clove. Once cured, garlic resists spoilage naturally. Stored whole, intact bulbs can last many months, sometimes over a year. Garlic's natural sulfur compounds inhibit bacteria and mold, making it one of the earliest naturally shelf-stable foods. Portuguese kitchens relied on it not just for flavor, but for protection against illness, hunger, and blandness. Used daily in soups, stews, marinades, and sausages, garlic anchors Portuguese cooking. It begins meals quietly, sizzling in oil. It stretches ingredients and makes simple foods satisfying, sharp, fragrant, enduring. Yet garlic supports other foods rather than standing alone. The next staple is the opposite, singular, massive, reserved for seasons and celebrations. Presunto is time made visible. Long before refrigeration, Portuguese farmers learned to preserve entire legs of pork through salt and air. By the Middle Ages, especially in regions like Alentejo and Trás-os-Montes, curing ham was a yearly ritual tied to winter slaughter. The process begins with salting fresh pork legs for weeks, drawing out moisture. After resting, the hams are washed and hung to dry in cool, ventilated spaces. Over months, sometimes years, the meat slowly matures. Fat softens, flavor deepens. Moisture continues to leave. This drying creates an inhospitable environment for bacteria. Properly cured presunto can last for years. Historically, hams were stored high in cellars, sliced only when needed. Presunto was food and savings, reserved for guests, holidays, or emergencies. Even during famine, one ham could feed a household slowly. Served thinly sliced with bread or melon, it is rich, salty, and intense. A little satisfies deeply. Presunto does not rush, it waits, and the pantry follows, returning next to heat, spice, and preservation by fire. Piri-piri arrived in Portugal by ship. In the 15th and 16th centuries, Portuguese explorers brought chili peppers back from Africa and the Americas. The plant adapted quickly, especially in the south, where sun and heat mirrored its origins. What followed was not just a taste preference, but a preservation habit. Fresh chilies spoil fast. Dried chilies endure. Peppers are harvested at full ripeness, then laid out under the sun or hung in strings to dry completely. As moisture leaves, heat concentrates. Color deepens. Time stops. Once fully dried, piri-piri can last for years when kept dry and away from light. Mold cannot survive without moisture. For households, this meant heat on demand, stored through seasons when fresh produce vanished. Dried chilies are crushed into flakes, steeped in oil or vinegar, or used whole to season meat and fish. A small amount transforms an entire dish. In the 20th century, dried piri-piri became inseparable from grilled chicken and seafood. It is fire-made portable, spice preserved as memory. But while chilies survive by drying, the next staple survives by immersion. Salt and water working slowly in glass and clay. Fresh olives are inedible, bitter, astringent. The solution, known for more than 4,000 years, is brine. Olive cultivation in Portugal dates back to Roman Lusitania, with extensive groves documented in Alentejo by the 2nd century CE. After harvest, olives are cracked or slit and submerged in salt water. Over weeks or months, the brine draws out bitterness and prevents spoilage. Lactic fermentation sometimes occurs, deepening flavor and stability. Salt and acidity protect the fruit. When kept submerged and sealed, brined olives can last for years without refrigeration. Traditional Portuguese households stored them in stone jars or glass bottles in cool spaces. Used daily in salads, stews, and bread, olives provided fat and salt when little else did. During scarcity, they became a meal themselves. Firm, salty, enduring. And after fruit preserved in brine, the pantry turns again toward sweetness, toward gold sealed in glass, surviving exactly as it is. Honey never needed to be taught how to last. It arrived knowing. In Portugal, beekeeping dates back to Roman Lusitania, with written references from the 1st century CE describing honey used as food, medicine, and offering. Rural regions like Serra da Estrela and Trás-os-Montes became known for wildflower and heather honey, shaped by altitude and dry summers. Honey survives because it refuses moisture. Naturally low in water and high in acidity, it creates an environment where bacteria cannot live. When sealed, it does not spoil. It crystallizes. It darkens. But it remains safe indefinitely. Archaeologists have opened ancient honey, still edible after thousands of years. Traditional Portuguese honey production follows the seasons. Bees collect nectar from rosemary, eucalyptus, orange blossom, and chestnut. The honeycomb is harvested, uncapped, spun, and strained. No preservatives, no processing, just time and gravity. Once poured into glass or ceramic jars, honey waits. In Portuguese kitchens, honey sweetens bread, cheese, pastries, and herbal remedies. It soothed coughs, preserved fruit, and fueled labor before sugar was common. During hardship, honey provided calories when little else could. Slow, golden, unchanged. But preservation also found sweetness through fire and alcohol. The next item captures fruit at its peak, strengthened so it lasts without ever softening. Zizinha was born in Lisbon in the 19th century, where sour cherries met alcohol and patience. According to tradition, a Galician friar first macerated zinja cherries in aguardente at the Igreja de Santo Antonio. What followed became ritual. The process is simple and enduring. Ripe sour cherries are submerged in high-proof alcohol with sugar and sometimes cinnamon. Alcohol preserves what it touches. It halts fermentation, it seals flavor. Over months, the cherries release color and aroma into the liquid. Once strained or left whole, Zizinha becomes shelf-stable indefinitely. Stored in glass bottles, it does not spoil. It matures. It deepens. Lisbon taverns have kept the same batches aging quietly for years. Zizinha became popular after the 1840s, sold in small cups to warm bodies and mark moments. It survived political change, poverty, and modernization because it required little and kept forever, served chilled or at room temperature, sometimes with a cherry at the bottom. It is sweet, sharp, and direct, a memory bottled. Time made drinkable. Porto was created to last because it had to travel. In the late 17th century, as English merchants sought wine that could survive the sea journey north, winemakers in the Douro Valley found the answer. They stopped fermentation early by adding aguardente. Sugar remained. Alcohol rose. Wine endured. By 1756, the Marquis of Pombal formally demarcated the Douro wine region, one of the first protected wine regions in the world. This was not about luxury. It was about control, stability, and survival of a product that anchored trade and identity. Fortification made Porto resilient. High alcohol and sugar prevent spoilage. Once sealed in barrels or glass bottles, port does not expire. Properly stored, it lasts for decades. Some styles improve for generations. In cellars along the Douro and in, barrels rested quietly while history unfolded above them. Port was stockpiled as wealth and insurance, opened for births, marriages, losses, and quiet nights. During hardship, it held value when currency failed. It is dark, warm, and patient. Wine taught to wait, but not every staple is liquid or ceremonial. The next one sits quietly in sacks and jars, feeding families not with symbolism, but with daily endurance. Carolino rice does not shout. It sustains. Brought to the Iberian Peninsula by the Moors between the 8th and 10th centuries, rice cultivation took hold in river valleys like the Mondego, Cedo, and Tagus. Carolino, a short grain variety, became Portugal's backbone rice. After harvest, rice is dried thoroughly before milling. This drying removes moisture that would cause spoilage. Stored as whole grain in sacks or sealed containers, Carolino rice can last for years when kept dry. No refrigeration, no treatment, just patience. For centuries, rice fed rural and urban households alike. It stretched stews, absorbed flavor, and turned small amounts of protein into full meals. During the 20th century, especially during shortages, rice meant security. A pantry anchor. Carolino rice is prized for how it releases starch. Creamy but structured. Ideal for soups, arroz de marisco, and peasant dishes where broth mattered more than abundance. Dry, pale, and quiet, it waits without complaint. And with rice stored and wine aging, the Portuguese pantry reaches its final truth. Survival was never about excess. It was about knowing what could wait. Onions were never treated as fragile in Portugal. They were treated as essential. cultivated since Roman Lusitania. Onions appear in agricultural records from the 1st century CE and became foundational across Portuguese cooking, especially in regions like Ribatejo and Alentejo, where storage mattered as much as yield. Onions preserve themselves when handled correctly. After harvest, they are cured, laid out in dry, ventilated spaces until their skins fully dry and tighten. This outer layer seals moisture inside and blocks bacteria from entering. Once cured, onions are braided or stored in mesh sacks and kept away from light and humidity. Whole onions can last for many months, sometimes close to a year. No salt, no smoke, just air and patience. During winters and droughts, this mattered. Onion meant flavor when nothing else was fresh. It began nearly every dish, sautéed slowly in olive oil, forming the base of soups, stews, rice, and sauces. In times of scarcity, onions added substance and sweetness after long cooking. They stretched meals quietly. They asked little and gave much. Sharp when raw. Sweet when slow cooked. Always waiting. And when the pantry holds onions, it almost always holds their companion, a liquid older than borders, pressed from trees that refuse to rush. Olive oil has flowed through Portugal for over 2,000 years. Roman presses operated across Alentejo as early as the 2nd century CE, and olive groves survived empire, invasion, and drought because the oil could wait when everything else failed. Extra virgin olive oil comes from the first cold pressing of ripe olives. No heat, no chemicals. Once pressed, the oil is filtered and stored in dark glass bottles, clay jars, or metal tins. Low moisture and high antioxidants protect it naturally. When kept away from light and heat, olive oil remains stable for years. It mellows, it deepens. It does not spoil easily. For Portuguese households, oil was both food and safeguard. It preserved vegetables, fed fasting days, fueled lamps when nothing else could. Used daily but never wasted, olive oil defines Portuguese cooking. It softens onions, carries garlic, finishes fish and bread. During hardship, it was sustenance on its own. Smooth, green gold, enduring. With oil sealed and bulbs cured, the Portuguese pantry tells its final story. Preservation was never fear. It was foresight learned from land, sea, and time. While Portugal preserves against oceans and distance, Spain preserves against heat and history. Different climates, shared instinct. Salt, oil, patience, and time bind both tables together. But how does preservation change when olive groves replace Atlantic winds and fire replaces sail? Find out in this next video right here.